In Henderson, Kentucky, there's a place that has been virtually untouched by time. A place, regardless of the changing world, still shows the true nature of the town. Welcome to Benvenue Farm, the home of the historic Soper family.
Hello, I'm Max Soper. I'm a direct descendant of Colonel Richard Henderson, and I'm here at the home place called Benvenue Farms, and I would like to kind of document the history of this place because I'm the last Soper that is living on the place, and probably upon my death the place will be sold. So a few things I'd like to get people to know about the place.
The story of the Soper farm is closely tied to the story of Colonel Richard Henderson, an ancestor of the Sopers.
Let me tell you about Richard Henderson. He was from Virginia and started a land company in 1775. Now, he was a land speculator, and even though the name of the company was the Richard Henderson Company, it was commonly referred to as the Transylvania Company. Well, Richard Henderson in 1775 made a deal with the Cherokee Indians at Sycamore Shoals, Tennessee, called the Treaty of Watauga, where he purchased for $50,000 worth of trade goods and silver. He bought most of Kentucky and Tennessee from the Cherokees. Well, he sent his Thomas Allen and Samuel Hopkins and James Hogue to petition the Virginia legislature to make this the 14th colony. There were some people that were in the Virginia Congress that were kind of upset that they didn't get in on the land deal like Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. So they wouldn't accept his proposal as being the 14th colony. And also they voided the treaty he had made with the Cherokee Indians for the land purchase. But in recognition of what he had done in the helping settle this part of the country, the Virginia legislature granted the Richard Henderson Company 200,000 acres, which at the mouth of the Green River, which is most of Henderson County right now.
Henderson County has a rich history. Part of that would be the Soper farms. The farm dates back to the early days of Henderson, with Soper being one of the founders of Henderson County, along with Henderson and Hopkins. The farm is the only farm still standing that gives some idea of what the history was like and what was taking place here. Tobacco was king, and the plantation reflects that. You have the original farmhouse that was all built by hand, plus the outbuildings on that. Most of the farm is still intact, and it preserves what was here. Not only was it one of the main tobacco farms of the area, but it was also the first winery, as well as other aspects of the early history here. As one of the last standing farms, still intact, of the early history, it preserves what is gone.
The farm story is not limited strictly to the founding of Henderson County. It has affected many historic events and figures as well.
William Soper was engaged in the freshwater pearls and mussel shells. He was probably one of the largest producers of freshwater pearls and mussel shells in the world up until 1900. There's a sleeping loft over the part of the house where it was alleged that Audubon stayed there when he was out here doing his Birds of America book, gathering samples and stuff. There's an old four-poster bed that was in the house, and it won first prize for American craftsmanship at a World Furniture Expo in London in 1865. In 1925, Henry Ford came down and he tried to purchase that bed, and my dad wouldn't sell it. So he sent back home, and he got some of his craftsmen and architects, and they came down for 2 weeks and made drawings and measurements and things of that bed. So I'm kind of curious to know if they ever built anything, if they ever built one, but they did try to make a copy of it. So that was pretty interesting, I thought.
It turns out craftsmanship runs in the Soper line. Max's preferred trade, knife making.
Well, today I'm going to be forging a small belt knife. Using my coal forge here, I prefer doing things the old way. I have a gas forge if I need to up production, but I like doing everything without modern conveniences. I'm using a piece of high carbon steel. This is 5160. There are all types of steel you can use for making a knife, but this one is more forgiving. And I started forging knives back in 1989 because I couldn't afford the fancy high-dollar custom knives, and you couldn't buy a good factory knife. So that's what piqued my interest in knife making. So we got the end of it red. I'm gonna beat a little bit on both sides to draw a point. Okay, so now I have a point. I can start figuring out my blade length, and I'm going to make it about 6 inches long. So I'm trying to heat this up to about 6 inches, and then I'll start drawing out the blade. Alrighty, now I'm going to start my blade right about here, and I'm going to pound the same spot and draw the edge out. I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. Now I'm going to start drawing the edge out the whole length of the blade. And as you notice, when you do that, when you beat on the edge, the blade will start to curve upwards. Another heat, and I'll refine the edge, make it look a little bit better. I'm going to work on the point a little more. Okay, so there we basically have the blade done. Now I'm going to work on the handle, and a blade this size ought to have 4.5 inch handle, roughly, by eye work. The knives I make, they're no real measurements. If I'm copying something, I do it by eye, unless someone specifies. So I'm heating up what's going to be the handle and cut it off. And this is a hot cutter. I'll cut it off on the anvil. I don't like using power tools. Okay, I'm going to cut this off about 4 inches. You want to be careful flying hot pieces. Now I'll put it back in, heat it, and draw it out and start shaping it. The secret to making a good knife is not to let the steel get too hot, and to always experiment, always test your blades. Don't take it for granted because everything looks right and works right. About 1 out of every 8 of mine I will take out and destroy. I'll bend them, I'll chop with them, I'll try and snap them in half, see what they'll do. I'm going to draw this handle out, make it a little bit longer. Now the next step for me is to take this up to my other shop and grind the lines true, grind the edge on it, and then the next step on that would be to harden and temper it. Now to harden it, I have to put the blade back in the forge and bring it up to the critical temperature. And the critical temperature of this type of steel is 1450 degrees. Well, unless you've been doing it for a long time, you can't tell how hot that is, and it's the non-magnetic stage. So I keep a magnet. When it's red and the magnet will no longer stick, then it's the right temperature. I will take the edge. I have oil in this trough that I'll heat up to 140 degrees. I'll lay the blade in horizontally for about a ½ inch. I only want the oil to come up about a ½ inch on the blade. And I'll leave it in that position until the top of the blade turns black and all the heat's gone out of it. Then I'll drop the whole thing down in the oil. Now what that does, that'll harden the bottom ½ inch and leave the top soft. And you want the top soft so it'll make a knife that'll take a lot of abuse and flex and whatever. Now once it's hardened, you have to then draw back the temper because it'll be hard like a file. You could smack it on the anvil and it'll shatter like glass. So you have to take some of that hardness out of it. And to do that, you have to, I use an oven. You can stick it in the fire until, stick it in the oven at about 425 degrees for 2 hours. And that puts heat back in the blade, draws some of the hardness out of it. Take it out of the oven, let it sit, cool to room temperature, then back in the oven for another hour, then out, then back in for another hour, and then you finish it any way you want, and you have a good, strong, tough knife. So, that's... Thomas Allen was the surveyor, and Samuel Hopkins was in charge of overseeing all this property. So they came to Henderson in 1797 and built a cabin, the start of this house here. The cabin is the back wing of the house. As they did that, they lived out of this cabin, they surveyed the town of Henderson. Well, this, like I say, belonged to Samuel Hopkins. Well, in 1806, his daughter Elizabeth got married to a Philip Barber, and the General Hopkins gave this land to his daughter as a wedding present. Philip left town on business in 1818. While he was gone, he died. She sold the place to Robert Threshley in 1827, who in turn, in 1834, sold it to William Soper. Okay, William Soper was born in Maryland in 1796. He left home at the age of 16 and came to Henderson in 1812 because his dad had remarried and he couldn't get along with his stepmother. So he came to Henderson with another young man and lived in town here. He married Susan Frances Henderson in 1830. Now, Susan Henderson was the daughter of Richard Henderson and Ann Alvis. And this Richard Henderson was the son of Samuel Henderson and Betsy Calloway, who were the first white couple to be married in Kentucky and had the first white child in Kentucky. So that's how we get tied into the Henderson line. Now, he got the farm in 1834. They added on these two wings, the upper story, and it's remained unchanged since. When they made these improvements, they named the place Benvenue. That's because Sir Walter Scott's poem, Lady of the Lake, had just come out, and it reminded them of their homeland in Scotland. So they named the place Benvenue. Most of the old buildings have been torn down over the years. The house servant's house is still around the corner. The old ice house is west of the house here. I can remember when we used to cut the ice out of the pond and haul it into the ice house and pack it in straw and sawdust to get you through the summer. We had 40 slaves working here year-round. When the Emancipation Proclamation came about, which only freed the slaves in the rebel states, they all were given their freedom and $100, and none of them left. My granddad, William, he did extensive genetic research on Hereford cattle and one of the top breeders in the country. And he also was involved with N.G. Penniman, who was champion racehorse man. We did extensive studies on the Irish racehorse and thoroughbreds, and they had winners from California to New York to Florida. And I can remember in my youth, some of the horses, when they were injured or whatever, they'd come and stay up here in the old mule barn to recuperate. And this barn was built in 1926, and it burned down before it was completed and rebuilt in 1927. Well, at that time, it was the largest mule barn in the state of Kentucky.
Caring for animals is another thing that has not changed over the years. Nowadays, they partake in animal rehabilitation for a number of critters.
Wildlife rehabilitation is taking abandoned and an injured animal and nurturing it and healing it and releasing it back into the wild when it's ready. Like Emmett here, he is 5 months old, and I have had Emmett since June of this year, 2010. And we have bottle fed him 4 or 5 times a day. We make sure he has corn, which is high in protein for him. I also rehabilitate raccoons, squirrels, possums, skunks, buzzards, hawks, owls. Sometimes we will take the hawks and the owls to raptor rehabs in Louisville, Kentucky, which is a rehab center for wild and exotic birds. I just don't do snakes. I've had up to 6 deer and 7 or 8 baby raccoons, 2 or 3 squirrels, but this year I only received 1, which is Emmett. Last year I had 2. The year before last, that's when I had 6 deer and 8 raccoons and 2 squirrels and 4 rabbits. I usually get my animals from either other rehabilitators that are full and no longer can handle a large amount of animals, or they don't know what they're doing with the animals. They don't have experience in raising, say, a deer or a raccoon. Also from other people that are not wildlife rehabilitators, and they just think it's cute and pick the animal up and find out when it gets about maybe 4 or 5 weeks old that they're really chaotic and crazy. So we just get them from all over the place, just not in Indiana or anything like that. We get them mainly from the state of Kentucky. And we release them back into the wild once they are ready, which is a long process, depending on, if they're injured or what's wrong with them. And they live here on the farm. I'm mama deer, I'm mama raccoon, mama hawk, mama bird. Being a wildlife rehabilitator makes your heart smile. When I have an injured animal or abandoned animal, this right here is all worth the while.
What made the Benvenue farm so successful is its business done in the tobacco industry. It is actually quite surprising how much money Henderson, Kentucky pulled in because of it.
Tobacco was the main cash crop in these days, and in 1860, Henderson, Kentucky was the second wealthiest city in the world because of the tobacconists. Well, in 1912, a warehouse was built where all the farmers brought their tobacco, and it was unloaded by a warehouse man, sorted, weighed, aligned, and then representatives from all the companies would come in and bid on it. Well, this was a better deal for the farmers because they could get a better price, and it was an auction. So in 1915, William Soper built the Soper Tobacco Warehouse and the Tri-State Tobacco Warehouses, and started that practice of being the warehouse man for all the farmers and whatever, and became one of the largest dark tobacco warehouses in the country. Then we got out of the tobacco business. Well, my dad was a tobacconist, got out in the late 70s, and tobacco has since crashed. Everybody goes with just your basic grain crops, corn and soybeans, of which we've headed that way too. We have 362 acres that we cultivate, half of it being in corn and half of it being in soybeans. We also ventured into wine. We made mostly blackberry and grape wine. When there was a blight in Europe, we sent a lot of our cuttings over to France and Italy, and got them all restarted. So there's a touch of Henderson, or as my dad used to say, there's Richard Henderson Soper grapes over there. And the taste of the wine varied depending on the sun, the wind, the rain. It varied year to year, and we quit making it. They still made it for the local churches and stuff, but didn't make it commercially. And at that time, in 1930s, Benvenue was the oldest licensed winery in the country. That's not saying there aren't any that were older. We were just the oldest licensed one in the country.
Today, the Soper farm doesn't produce tobacco or wine. Instead, it produces that classic commodity.
All right, today I'm talking Cannons 101. This is not an original, but it's an authentic 1841 Civil War cannon. It's a 6-pounder, bronze. And the reason I started getting involved in cannons was, for one, my eyesight's getting worse, and I figure I have a bigger shell to hit the target with these. Also, back in 1991, I acquired my first cannon barrel and was looking for someone to buy a carriage from. And I called around, and at that time there were 3 manufacturers, and they all wanted $10,000 for a carriage, and I couldn't afford that. So I started making my own, and I got blueprints, historical blueprints, copied them to a T. My first 2 were pretty shabby. I got them laid away up in the barn, and the more involved I got, the more technical I got. These things are dead on, historically accurate to every nut, screw, bolt, what have you. I make the wooden carriages. I did not make the wheels. The wheels came out of Colonial Williamsburg. Carl Geyer made the wheels. But the ironwork and the rest of the wood, I did myself. Takes about a month full-time to make one. And I figure over the course of 20 years, I've made about 35 of them. Originally, a crew for a cannon was 8 men. It took 8 men to man the cannon, and you had your limber, which was your ammunition cart that was 15 feet behind the trail of the cannon with the horses attached to that. The trail hooked up to the back of the limber and made a 4-wheel cart that 6 horses pulled. These things have a range about 2,800 yards, but firing was kept within eyesight. Usually most of the shooting was done 1,000 yards or less. It fired a solid round ball, which was good for if you had an advancing infantry or cavalry. You wouldn't actually shoot at the mass, you would shoot in front of it and have the ball hit the ground and ricochet, and it would just haphazardly ricochet and just keep on going. You cannot stop them. I have tried with this thing, actually I shot at a target that was through the trees there, and I cut down some trees and I heard the ball go through another tree line, then another tree line, then another tree line, ricochet off a hillside and go into another tree line. I thought, well, there's the neighborhood about 1.5 miles that direction. I hope I didn't get anything. So you can't stop an iron ball. They're not like the modern rifle balls or anything that are made out of lead. They're not going to hit mushroom. They're just going to ricochet and keep on going. And you've probably read accounts in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War where people will see a cannonball rolling at them and they'll put their foot out and try and stop it. Well, it'll take their foot or their leg with it and just keep on going. So today I'm going to show you how this thing sounds, how to load it and everything. But like I say, it takes 8 men to crew it, but actually only 4 fire it. The reason it takes 8 is because when you're firing a shell, the gun will jump up about a foot off the ground and roll back about 15 yards. And then it takes everybody to roll it back into position and fire it. Now at reenactments, and since I'm just firing powder, it won't move at all. So most of your time was spent in sighting the gun. So you had 4 people on the front that were that did the loading process. One's in the back running ammunition forward, and one's on the limber box. On my command to fire, fire! Alrighty, now I need a... What? Alright.
We have seen a knife forged and a cannon fired. We have seen animals in need of care. We have heard about the rich and surprising story of the Soper Benvenue farm. By that time, we were wondering why. Why carry on their traditions that the founders of the county started many years ago?
Because it was thrown at me. I'm not, but the farm's fallen down, it's dilapidated, I can't keep up with it, but I'm the only Soper living here that even remotely knows any of the history or cares any at all about it. I mean, you know, we've had offers to sell from Walmart and developers, and most people would probably do that, but one thing my dad did instill in me is that, you know, you can go through the money, but they're not making any more land, and if you have land, you better hold on to it. So I'm set my foot down, and I'm here to hold on to the place till I die.